Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. That's bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. Today we have a repeat guest. Lindsay Maslin from Appalachian State University is here again to chat with us. Thanks for coming today, Lindsay.
Sure, glad to be here.
So I wanted to bring you back, not so much because of what you do in the classroom, but because you have a faculty development role. So can you give the listeners just a brief intro to what you're doing in that domain?
Sure. So in addition to being a classroom teacher, I am the Assistant Director of Faculty Development at App State. And we have 20,000 students that we serve and all of the faculty that teach them. And so, I do a lot of faculty development work in-house in terms of, workshops, book clubs, writing retreats, week-long institutes, multi-month, self-paced or even synchronous online learning for the faculty, for the teachers. So I do that kind of stuff. And then I also kind of do it outside of the university as well. I really enjoy working with universities other than my own when they need a workshop or some kind of professional development in a specific area.
Well, great. Thank you. And thank you for doing that work. It makes a difference. I was really excited. I saw on social media that you have created a YouTube video called, I believe, The Worst Lecture Ever.
Yep, that's right.
And what I thought was great about that was there were probably some things in there that might be surprising to faculty, even to faculty that think they're doing a pretty good job in this space of creating an environment of belonging. So could we maybe talk about how there's language that's power, and there's power in language with some of the more subtle bits from that video? And if you want to give a brief intro to the video, we'll link it in the show notes, but also let people know what we're talking about.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so with that video, the reason I made it actually is because I was starting to notice a trend among the requests I was getting for professional development, kind of during the 2020 year, because we were contending with dual pandemics of COVID-19, but also racism, and those two things interacting with each other and the implications for classroom teaching. And so folks were asking both for how to teach well online or synchronous or teaching online. But they also wanted to make sure that teaching was inclusive. And because of that, I thought, okay, well, I guess a good way to get into this would be to come up with an example of the opposite of inclusive online teaching, or specifically, online lecturing. And so I pulled together some of my friends. Some of them are faculty development friends. Some of them are theater friends. Some of them live in both worlds, and recorded. It's a 12-minute fake lecture, and it's supposed to simulate a 50-minute lecture, but kind of sped up in some places. And I did that so that when I lead workshops on inclusive online teaching, we could have something to talk about. So that's, I guess, the intro to what the video is, and I'm happy to have everybody see it. And in that video, there's over 30 unique errors that the professor makes. There's some errors she makes over and over again, but there's 30 unique ones. And it's funny as I talk about this because the professor is me. But it's so different than the way that I try to be in a classroom that I really do feel like I'm watching a different person. So I call her the professor. And so it's been interesting because I've been using it in a lot of different workshops and things like that, and asking people, what did you notice? And there's some really egregious, obvious things that people notice. The professor is rude, talks way too fast, uses really complex vocabulary. Pretty much everybody picks that up. But then there's also a lot of more subtle things that once I point them out, people go, oh. And then the other thing that happens is, and I'm saying this is happening in the context usually of a Zoom workshop where I also have discussion happening in the chat, people are starting to say, "Uh-oh, I'm noticing some uncomfortable similarities between myself and what I saw in that video," which is kind of the point. So I'd say that some of the more subtle ones that people might miss do relate to language and the power that language holds. Like, for example, so I mean, saying that there's power in language, I think that's something we've probably heard since we were children. Like, if you remember your English teachers wanting you to write with juicy adjectives or something like that. And the reason they want you to do that is because there's power in language. Language can make somebody feel a certain way. And I think we all know that's true. But it shows up in the classroom too, because the actual words that we use can either empower students, it can enhance their belongingness, their feelings of identity, or it can marginalize and disenfranchise students, I'd say. So should we talk about some of the specific examples of that?
Yes, please. And if I can pick one to start with.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some language that may not be familiar for first generation college students.
Sure.
So we might assume that everyone knows what something is, but that's not the case.
Yes.
If you're not looking very approachable, people probably aren't going to ask.
Right. So I can give kind of two interesting examples from the video. One that I didn't even think about, but that was brought up to me by one of the participants, one of the actors in the video, who himself was a first generation college student, now a faculty developer. But the word syllabus, he said that he was, as a first generation college student, he went this first few months of college not knowing what the word syllabus meant. And you can think about how common that is in our lexicon as professors, and how if we're just throwing that word around and assuming that students would know what's contained in a syllabus and why the syllabus exists and those kinds of things. If you're somebody for whom that is a foreign language, you're going to feel pretty excluded. Another common one is office hours. We say that all the time, but office hours sounds a lot like a time when the professor is going to be working in their office. And in fact, I mean, I've been guilty of viewing it that way. Like maybe students will come by, but I'm going to sit in here and I'm going to actually plan things that are going to get done during office hours. But really, if we're using those correctly, they should be student hours. And so simply making a shift to student hours, conversation hours, I've seen them called, that's more inclusive, makes it clear that that is time that is set aside for you as a student to come talk to me if you want or need to. So I guess that's just two quick examples of things that we throw those terms around. We certainly aren't meaning to be exclusionary when we use those terms, but it might be happening. Anyways.
Great. Thank you. Do you want to pick the next one, or do you want me to prompt you?
Oh, how about, well, so there's, throughout that video, there's a variety of things the professor says that are kind of reinforcing dominant identities. So at one moment, the professor says, "Ladies and gentlemen," addresses the group as ladies and gentlemen. And that is, reinforcing the gender binary, that there are only two genders and that they are ladies and gentlemen. And so if a student is in your class whose gender identity does not line up with one of those buckets, they're going to feel excluded. And I'm sure that a professor who starts the day saying, "All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started," is not making that choice on purpose to say, and I don't mean you, non-binary students, like that's not what they're trying to do, but it is what's happening. And so that's why I always say y'all all the time. Now I'm from the South, so that word does feel safe in my mouth, but I know that's not true for everybody. But it's a nice kind of non-gender descriptor for groups of folks. And in fact, I used to intentionally not say y'all because I associated it with that Southern stereotype of Southerners being dumb. And again, myself being a Southerner. And so I didn't want to reinforce that stereotype. But then I decided to kind of flip it on its head as a point of resistance. And now I use y'all probably too much, but just as a way to kind of give power to it, like reclaiming the term.
The over y'allin'.
Yep.
I like that. I'm going to think about some options because guy is problematic in a different way, right? Because it reinforces a male as dominant. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so folks, people, depending on, you're kind of teaching philosophy, my friends might or might not feel comfortable. People, I think I just said people. Yeah. I know some people who say scholars. So you kind of have to think about what would feel authentic in your mouth. And for me, it's y'all.
And you could use your mascot if you like it. I could say Setonians.
Oh, yes. I could say mountaineers. Mm-hmm. That's who we are. Good call. Yeah, so that's one example of kind of unintentionally reinforcing privileged identities, which just further serves to take a student who might already be questioning whether or not they fit in this classroom, and then you get that really subtle but important microaggression, essentially, that serves as saying, no, you don't fit here. Another place that this kind of thing shows up, it doesn't directly, it's not explicitly said in the video, but this is a thing that I'll see when people are talking about, when teachers are talking about research results that are in some way have been separated out by racial or cultural group or gender group or something like that. I guess we can specifically talk, that's been disaggregated by race. A real common thing is people will call, they'll talk about white people versus minorities, and how you could see that if a student themselves were a non-white student, because that's basically what the second group is saying. If you have a student in the class who identifies with that group, how simply using the word minority, well, it's problematic on a couple levels. First of all, globally, non-white folks are the majority, not the minority. So it's kind of mathematically incorrect in a lot of ways. But it also kind of conveys, a sense of less than or deficit. It's also just really imprecise, and kind of communicating that white is the default category. And so we need a label for everything that is not the default. And I should say, I'm saying this as a white person, that positionality is probably important. And so I think it would be important for professors to think about that. And there's not a non-messy way to do this, but to kind of hold yourself to a higher standard with your language, and maybe think about, are you talking about a specific group of folks? If you're talking about, Black students or Black men or Latina women or something, whatever group you're talking about, actually use the label there. And then if it is really true that you're talking about anybody who's not white, to sit with that and say, why is it that you feel like using a single word for everybody that is not in that group feels okay to you? What does that mean? So there's not like, I know, like with the case with ladies and gentlemen, there are some alternatives that most people feel good about. But there are problems with every label. Because sometimes people will say people of color. They'll say Black and Indigenous people of color. They will say minoritized individuals, marginalized individuals, people from groups who have been systematically oppressed, so there's all of these words. None of them are perfect, but all of them better than minority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it could be a space where you have a conversation in class too about what words we prefer, depending on when this comes out.
I mean, that's a good
conversation with this with another guest.
Oh yeah.
Either right soon before or right after this one comes out.
Oh, that's cool. All right, good connection then.
I felt like I had a follow-up question about that. Oh, in terms of when you might have some papers from the field that you would like to bring into your classroom, but that have this problematic language, do you endorse bringing this? Feels like the conversation around artists, right? Do we bring it in and talk about where the problems are and still talk about the results? Do we instead strive to find something that's doing it better?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Well, I think it kind of depends on what your learning goals are. And also, though, the responsibility that you have if you are bringing a paper into a class that perpetuates or reestablishes these kinds of systemic oppression issues or these problematic kind of power imbalances and things. So for example, if you're teaching a research methods class or something like that, or a science class, a math class, and you want to bring in a paper because you really do want to highlight the actual results, you can do that. And I think you could do that in the language of the authors, but I think you have a responsibility to then bring up the issue, even if it feels tangential to the topic that you're teaching. You might be saying, well, I'm teaching t-tests today. I'm not teaching, the problems inherent in calling this group of people that they assessed minority. But I mean, I would say we all have the responsibility to just always have that conversation going. And you can set the stage for that in your class, even if you feel like I'm not teaching a class about things that pertain to diversity, equity, inclusion, race, culture, any of those things. Even if the class isn't about that, I still think we have a responsibility to understand the intersectionality of those identities with whatever the class is about. And I think if you start the semester from that space and getting students to critique language or the way things have been done, that when you get to that paper that's a problem, and the students, they won't surprise you. They'll do exactly what you had hoped, which is they'll notice that, isn't that weird that that's the wording they used here? Yeah, I think we need to bring that in. I don't think we should necessarily shy away if we can't find an equivalent paper that does the same thing minus the problematic language. Then we use it as a learning experience for everybody.
Great, thank you. Let's maybe talk a little bit about power dynamics in the classroom, because that is also something that the video highlights.
Yeah, so like with the examples I was just giving, saying, that language has power, that those are pretty clear. They're kind of explicit. Like you can point to a very specific phrase and say, this phrase is a problem because XYZ. But that's not all that's going on, because we also have to think about not just the power of language, but the language of power, meaning whenever somebody who is in power communicates something, either through words or through actions, they are speaking the language of power. And so anytime that you are making a choice, a teaching choice, even if you're not saying anything, the simple fact that you've made a choice is implicitly communicating something. And I think this can be hard for some of us to wrestle with, because so many teachers that I know don't see themselves as powerful. Because teaching isn't, the most prestigious thing you can do at a society level. And then if you think about it at the level of academia, in a lot of places, teaching is disrespected. It is devalued. Is seen as easier or not as rigorous as, maybe research activities or other things we might occupy our time with. And so if you think of yourself in that place, and if you're somebody like me whose identity is as a teacher and connects more with teaching focused individuals, to be told like, well, you're really powerful in the classroom, I'd be like, what? No. But I think that it's possible for us to both be kind of devalued at the systems level, but still be perpetuating problematic, powerful stuff in our classrooms. Because, even if we don't feel powerful, as a teacher, we are the course designer. We are the curriculum chooser. We are the grade giver, right? We do have those places of power. And so I think that just like being colorblind doesn't end racism, it is not a good end to racism or white supremacy. Ignoring this very real power dynamic in your classroom isn't going to make it go away either. So I think we have to be really aware of the fact that even if we don't mean to communicate something by a decision or a line in our syllabus, we still are. So I guess an example could be, this is a hot one, like technology policies. Before so many of us were teaching online, technology policies manifested in terms of, are you allowed to have your cell phone? Are you allowed to do things on your laptop in a face-to-face class? Now the kind of new reincarnation of that is, the incarnation of that is, like, you have to have your camera on in Zoom or Google Meet or whatever you're doing. And people have very big feelings about, I guess we could just go with the cameras on one, since that seems to be a little more, timely. But and I get this question every single time that I do one of these workshops is, am I allowed to require, I think this is the language, am I allowed to require students to have cameras on? And when they ask that question, I think they think they're asking a very simple question with a very simple yes, no answer. But we could really dig into all the words, like, what do you mean by all the words that you just said? And even just the fact that, like, require is in the sentence tells you something about the power dynamic involved. So if we think about, obviously as a teacher, I can only speak from my experience, I would much rather speak to people in a Zoom room whose faces I can see as opposed to black boxes that I can see. Like, that is just a better time for everybody involved, because I can see if they look confused, I can see if they think I'm funny, I can see if they're bored. All of the things that we would normally rely on, those nonverbal cues we would rely on in a face-to-face classroom, that's our approximation for them, is those videos. But then, and so, yeah, I wish they would all have their cameras on too. But there's also a power dynamic involved there. So if I tell them, well, it's a policy in this class that you have your camera on, then I put myself in the shoes of the student who is taking class from a living situation that they don't want to share with other folks. Maybe they don't want their professor to see it. They don't want their peers to see it because they're worried what stereotypes might be attached to them. Maybe they are taking class from a household that has a lot of other folks in it. Maybe it's children that they are taking care of, or just roommates or something like that, and that having the camera on would actually be really distracting for the other folks in the class because of what's going on in the background. And so that's where I'm saying, like, a power dynamic exists, because if we require that of our students, we're saying, I require you to give me access to the intimate places of your life. And that is not something that we require in face-to-face. But even then, if we are requiring them in face-to-face to not have a cell phone or to not have a computer with them, we are taking a power stance and saying, I'm going to control a piece of your behavior. Now that gets kind of complicated, right? Because there is research out there, particularly on the face-to-face side. We don't have too much of the Zoom research yet about how laptops in the classroom can be distracting. So what do we do with that? Because there's research out there that actually supports the power choice to tell students. And so people oftentimes will bring that up. Well, what do I do though? Because we know that technology is distracting. I say the solution to all these kinds of power conundrums is, instead of thinking of it as, well, I know the research, I know it's best for you students, so I am going to make this call for your benefit, even though if that's really true, that this call would be for their benefit. Taking that stance is I have power over you stance. And it's much harder to want to learn from somebody that we feel like is controlling us. But a different approach could be, well, maybe we can have power together, power with each other. So maybe we can have a candid discussion about what's good and bad about cameras on, or what's good and bad about phones or laptops being used in the classroom. Get all the ideas out on the table, including the ones that are informed by research. And then kind of come to some class agreement about what would be best for our learning, our community, our belonging, whatever is the important value of the group. And there's research kind of using that approach. I think Bridget Hard has some stuff that she's published about that exact approach. So even that approach can be research-based, but it just feels so different to feel like we cooperatively made a choice about a policy in a class, as opposed to the teacher comes to me on day one with all of these controlling policies laid out.
That's good. And that's lots to think about as my semester starts as of this recording in 6 days. My accidentally being powerful when I'm trying to be helpful. Because I often think of that as like taking away a choice that may not be helpful for you.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. Like, it's some people want to take away their choices themselves, not have them taken from them. So that's
totally. Well, and it connects to theories we know from psychology, right? Like there's self-determination theory from the motivation corner of our field. That says that the most motivated folks are people who feel competent, they feel related to others, and they have a sense of autonomy. And so that autonomy piece is exactly what we're talking about here, that they feel like they had a say in what happened to them. And then we feel like if we have a say in what happens to us, we work harder, we're more motivated. And so if we as teachers, if our goal is something related to maximizing learning or maximizing achievement of course objectives, which may be about specific skills and facts, but may also be about students adopting certain value systems or lenses for interpreting the world, whatever it is, if that's what we really care about, then we should have students participate with us in making those choices, because in the long run, they will achieve more if they felt a sense of control in what happened to them.
That's good. I wrote those 3 words down. Competent, related, and autonomy.
Yes, that's right. Self-determination theory. Yeah, in fact, I mean, I'm not trying to plug here, but I just wrote a chapter for a book about resilient pedagogy, right? Designing classes in a way that it doesn't matter what mode you're in or you end up in if something happens, designing them in a way so that it kind of works for all students in all modes. And in that chapter, I tried to make that exact case that if we set up our classrooms to really maximize the competence, the relatedness, and the autonomy the students feel, then they're going to be really engaged and motivated. They're going to learn at high levels, and all of that's going to work even if something disruptive happens, either to the course as a whole or to an individual student or you as the teacher. So you can look for that. It's not published yet. It's with the editors now, the last round, but yeah.
That sounds great. Thank you for solving my problem.
There you go.
We are getting close to half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one more nugget you would like to leave people with?
I think maybe not a very specific thing, because if you go watch the video, you'll see a lot of them yourself, or you'll start kind of engaging in a dialogue with yourself about, do I do that? Or is that a problem? Or I think she put this in here to make a point about it. Why did she do that? So I think you'll be able to do, people who watch the video will be able to do a lot of that work themselves. But I guess in terms of trying to sum things up, and I often end up, saying this, like I think I've said something like this when I spoke with you before, Marianne, but, I don't think, most teachers don't intend for our classrooms to be places that are reinforcing problematic power structures. We're not making course design choices because we're really excited about replicating systems of oppression. I mean, maybe a very small few are, and those people need some very serious help. But like the rest of us, I don't think we're doing it on purpose. It's the whole intent versus impact thing, right? Nobody intends to be problematic with power or to replicate oppression, but it's happening anyways. And so I think that the best thing to do is for us to adopt an interrogative lens towards our teaching. I think that's the way to go, to always be asking ourselves, okay, how is this word or how is this teaching choice going to be experienced by my students? Not what I mean by it, but how might it actually be experienced by my students? And is that experience, that student experience, might it be different depending on the identity that a student holds, the lived experiences, the background experience a student holds? Might different students experience this in different ways? And am I okay with that? Is that what I want? Is that on purpose? And if it's not what I want, well, what am I going to do about it? Because to me, adopting that interrogative lens about the intent and the actual impact of your teaching choices, that's the responsible way to use your language of power. Because whether we want it or not, we are in a position of power as teachers. And so the way to use that responsibly is to think about it deeply and make sure you actually are doing what you mean to be doing when you're teaching.
Terrific. I'm going to put a picture of an interrogative lens in my office.
Oh, there you go. Well, a magnifying glass works good for that. I have magnifying glasses in a lot of my syllabi and stuff for that exact reason, to remind people we're always interrogating.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for your time, and I wish you a successful spring semester.
Thank you so much, and to all the listeners, I hope you guys have successful spring semesters and beyond as well.
Great, thank you. We've been chatting with Lindsay Maslin from Appalachian State University.